for pepperoni pizza.
Perfectly paired.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to a late night Didact Livestream. I actually wasn't going to hop on tonight. I was honestly just going to just do some work privately on my laptop and just call it an evening. But, I just sort of thought, like, why not? Why not just hop online and just do a little impromptu live stream? If any of you end up joining, glad to have you be a part of it. Yeah, I just figured, it's fun to do the small things too. You don't just have to do, big live streams with big announcements and like huge things to do and whatever. Part of building in public is just doing a lot of the small things, just the boring everyday stuff where people are just kind of chopping through, working on their projects, building their startup, and in my case, building an incredible piece of software. And, it's good to show the boring parts. It's good to show just sort of the everyday tasks and like I said, just kind of the boring parts and the humdrum of it. Because this is an incredible piece of software that I've put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into. And so, yeah, I'm going to try and do these a little more often because I had gotten out of the habit of it for a few months. And I think it's just kind of fun to bring all of you along with me, whoever ends up watching this, just to kind of build in public and share my thoughts about what Didact is. So yeah, without further ado, let's get to it. Welcome to the stream. Hope you don't mind the lo-fi music. I like to play it while I stream Didact stuff. All right. And if you end up joining as a viewer, make sure to say hello in the chat, okay? I still need to fix that stupid picture that always gets messed up. That's funny. All right. Did a few updates to the doc site again earlier today. So pulled those down to this machine just a little bit earlier. I was just thinking, I may have said this on previous live streams, or I may not have. I think I have at least a few times. I'm a pretty big fan of doing documentation-driven development. I like trying to write, documentation first, and sort of let that lead how I build the rest of the platform. If I, as a founder, if I put myself in your shoes and I try to see Didact, through your eyes, like it's the first time you're ever seeing the product, I think that's a good way for me as a founder to sort of work through the documentation side and building Didact and all that. I think it's a solid way to make the experience better for you, because developer experience, or DX for short, is extremely important to me as I'm building Didact. So you'll notice that I do spend a lot of time on the documentation, but I do that on purpose. I really do think documentation-driven development is just a really great way to sort of bake the DX in the whole way through, if that makes sense. Because, I'm building Didact solo, and I can build it to my specifications according to my guidelines, and it can be built the way I want it to be built. And it's something that I want to be proud of when I give it to you. So, DX is definitely something I've been thinking about, pretty much the whole way through. I hope that will become evident as version 1 gets released. I hope you can get a sense of that. And, with all V1s, there's always new features and bug fixes and so on that are on the way, and I get that. But I do hope that you'll get a nice sort of premium feel from the dock site, and hopefully from the rest of the platform too. It's going to be good. It's going to be good. So, kind of trying to do a quick recap on sort of where I'm at since I did my live stream. I think I did a live stream 2 days ago on Saturday. So just kind of some updates for you. So I've continued thinking through, how exactly I want to build out the deployments for the Flow libraries, because don't get me wrong, I've still got a good chunk of source code to get finished, but like the architectural design parts of Didact's V1 are by far the worst. And this is really like the last big piece to put together. Once this specific piece is put together, I think this is going to make, honestly, a lot of sense. Like, a lot of sense. Because once this is figured out, it's pretty much just source code crunching from there on out. Which, don't get me wrong, like I said, I mean, it is a good bit of work ahead of me. But it's something that I feel like I should be able to knock out by the end of this month. I would think at the latest. But I've got to finish this. This last architectural piece. It's just a real doozy trying to figure it out. That's kind of where we're at right now. I went through some complicated deployment ideas on the last live stream, and still trying to sort of continue to think about what it is I need to do to finish off deployments. Like how exactly do I need to build them out? I kind of have like grandiose ideas for what I want to do with deployments. On the one sense, I want them to be really flexible and really powerful so that you can basically pull a class library from multiple different deployment sources. But I'm not going to lie to you, that's a complicated set of features to build for a version 1. And I really think like the most basic deployment source probably makes the most sense for the first version. And who knows, depending on how you guys use Didact, I may find out that I don't even need some of the other ones for a good while. It just sort of depends on the feedback that you give me. So, some of the deployment source ideas that I had would be like, for example, if you have a class library that goes up into a GitHub repo, whenever you push an update onto your main branch, or you do like a PR, like let's say into your main branch, as you probably know, you can run CI/CD scripts in source code platforms like GitHub. So when you push a commit up to the main branch, let's say, or you open a PR into it, you could kick off a CI/CD job that would take your class library and build it on a just some cloud runner, Linux machine, whatever, up in GitHub Actions. And then you can run .NET CLI commands as a script in your CI/CD actions. What you can do with that is you can build a class library which will spit out a set of build artifacts once you build it and you publish it. And so you can store those build artifacts in GitHub. See, the difference is, like, normally when you're dealing with class libraries and CI/CD processes, normally like 99.999999999% of the time, what people are doing with CI/CD processes and .NET class libraries is they're publishing them to a NuGet package source somewhere, like NuGet.org or maybe like the NuGet sandbox or something like that. 99.999999999% of the time, that's the only CI/CD stuff you're going to do with a class library, right? But Didact's weird. It's a little different, right? Because it's all based off of... Oh, perfect. We're already open to the page. It's all based off of plugins. I want Didact Engine to be an always-on application where you don't have to shut it off every time you want to load a new Flow library in. If it's going to be an always-on application, then that means I have no choice but to use the plugin architecture. And I've talked about that a lot on previous live streams, that it's, it's basically inescapable. So going back to my GitHub Actions job example, instead of publishing your built .NET class library to like a NuGet feed somewhere, what you would do instead is you would build it locally, like up in the, CI/CD process, and then you would just store it somewhere. And I'm pretty sure when you push commits up that shoot off automated jobs in GitHub, and I'm assuming you can do this in like GitLab and a few others as well, you can store build artifacts somewhere. You can have like release artifacts on a given commit or a branch or something like that. But here's the other thing. You could also like, for example, like you could stuff, say, your build library, you could put it in like an S3 bucket up in AWS, like if you have an AWS tenant. Or maybe like if you have an Azure tenant, you could take your .NET class library, build it, and then throw it into an Azure blob. You could do that too. So those are some of the different, deployment sources that I want to support in future versions of Didact, so that you can pull things from cloud repositories or cloud, buckets up in Azure or AWS or wherever. I think that would be really nice and really powerful. But, the thing about it is, like, just don't think that's really a V1 thing, be completely honest with you. It's just not a V1 thing. And so I think I'm going to stick to basically the file system only. I think the file system is going to be the main version 1 deployment source for now. And we'll come back and we'll add the more advanced ones, at a later date. I think that would be a great, premium feature, a great V2 or V3 feature, or something like that. But I just want to get this finished so I can get out to you as quick as possible. So I really do think using like the local file system as really like the one exclusive, flow deployment source for the moment, I do think that kind of makes the most sense. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now, is I'm just sort of thinking to myself, like, I think we'll just stick to the file system deployment source for the time being. So yeah, I'm just basically just trying to wrap that up, architecturally, so I can get to the good stuff, get this out to you finally. Last time we talked about some of the different entities that I have in Didact. Like for example, I had a library entity and a library deployment entity. So I was kind of toying around with the idea of like, do I need both? Should I get rid of one of them? What sort of metadata do I really, actually need to store in a Didact's database? Just my 2 cents here. I think probably it does make sense to tie a specific deployment to a specific deployment source. I don't know that, or I think I call it a deployment type. Maybe deployment source is the better name for that, but yeah, I think deployment source and deployment, I think that's a one-to-one thing, a bidirectional one-to-one thing. Just trying to think, like, would I ever want one specific deployment to have access to multiple deployment sources? You know what I mean? Like, would I want like one class library deployment, let's say, to be like fetched simultaneously, like let's say from both like the local file system and an S3 bucket? Does that even make sense that like that would be the same deployment for the given class library, for the flow library. I don't know. The way I'm sort of thinking about deployments, you know, in my mind, they're kind of tied at like the parent level with a deployment. You know, a deployment source and a deployment are kind of tied together. I don't know, that's kind of my 2 cents. I keep saying deployment source, but technically it's called deployment type right now. But, you know, that's essentially what I mean. You know, last time I was sort of toying with the idea as well. Could I get rid of the library entity? You know, and just have a library deployment entity? Do I really need a library entity, or can I get a? Do I not? Like, do I actually need that? Basically, you know, I had sort of thought about putting the assembly name string property on the library deployment entity and maybe ditching the library entity completely. And I remember what we talked about last time were the versions, because, you know, I've got a flow version and I've got a flow library version, and together they form like a composite execution version. So, you know, the question is, coming back to those versions, how do we want to handle those? I spent a lot of time on the last live stream kind of going through that. Like, how exactly do we want to handle those? What do we want to do with that? It's a very good question. It's a very good question. Still kind of thinking about this, to be honest with you. So, like, just as a quick reminder, when Didact Engine retrieves a flow library from its deployment source, wherever that's supposed to be, in this case, like I was saying, just to keep things, you know, pretty simple for the first version, the only like deployment source I really want to support is the local file system. I think a local folder on your file system or a network folder, I just think that makes the most sense for the first version. So, when Didact Engine figures out that it needs to fetch a library deployment, it will look in the library deployment table and see if it's missing anything. And if it's missing anything, what it will do is fetch that library deployment from the source, and it will copy it or download it or do whatever it is that it needs to do and create essentially shadow copies, like runtime shadow copies of those plugin files that will go into runtime folders that the engine creates per plugin. So each flow library, and I should really be specific and say like each deployment goes inside of its own runtime like shadow copy folder, basically. That's where all the plugin files, you know, will go into. So, So like a given flow library is fetched from the deployment source. It's shadow copied to a local runtime folder specific to that deployments plugin. All of the plugin files get shadow copied into that runtime folder. Now the assembly load context that I've got built into Didact Engine, now it can find a string path where it can identify, the main DLL behind that class library, flow library in the shadow copy folder. Now I could feed a path into the assembly load context and just use the normal built-in dependency resolver to find all the associated, NuGet packages and dependencies that are contained within that class library. So once everything gets shadow copied to a runtime folder, all of the iFlows are located inside of your flow library using reflection, which is really tricky, by the way, when you have a bunch of assembly load contexts, because most reflection examples that you'll see on .NET online, they basically always assume that you're working in the default assembly load context. So you have basically one master container of all resolved dependencies inside of your .NET app. But when you throw plugins into the mix, it's really ugly and really painful. It's so painful. And it turns out like reflection is actually a lot more difficult when you're jumping across multiple assembly load contexts. Reflection across assembly load contexts is basically what I do. So Didact shadow copies the flow library build artifacts into a runtime folder. I link the string path to the class library's main DLL file. I send that into the assembly load context. When I do that, when I send it into the assembly load context, all of the assemblies get loaded. I find all of the iFlows through reflection across assembly load context, like I talked about. Okay, fair enough. All that's making sense. Okay. And then each one gets instantiated, and it runs the configure async method, which is what you see here on my screen. Configure async. That's one of the methods that you implement on the iFlow interface, is configure async. So, okay, fair enough. So you load the configure async method. Okay, makes sense. That will run all of the configure async methods for all iFlows. That essentially synchronizes all the metadata from all the flows into Didact's database. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay, fine. That seems to work pretty good. At that point, we're ready to go. The scheduler can start queuing jobs, and executions can start taking place, inside the flow library. That's kind of the idea behind it. So I'm just trying to think let's logically step through what the process steps are. So, when a flow library gets a shadow copied, and then all the iFlows start getting instantiated, and the configure async methods are executed, it's only at that point in time that any of the metadata from the flows gets saved to the Didact database. It's only at that point in time. And you know what else? You know what else I just thought about just now? I literally just thought about it. I mean, I'm not joking. I literally just thought about this. So Didact Engine has to synchronize all of the metadata from all of the configure async methods and all of the iFlows up to the database. But see, flow libraries are partitioned by environments. Environment is sort of like the base tenant identity inside of the data model for Didact. So everything is partitioned, I should say, at the environment level. So this is sort of a conundrum I've got on my hands from an entity perspective, because, like, let's say the same flow library, it could exist in 3 different tenants with the same exact name, but it's assigned to a different tenant each time. Does that make sense? So question, right? How do I know which tenants a configure async method needs to execute against? How do I know where to send a configure async method? Well, that comes from a flow library, which as of right now is an entity inside of the database. And it's also associated to a deployment and a deployment source, which are also entities in the database. Those have environments added to them inside the entities themselves. Because again, environment is sort of like the tenant identifier, you could say, in Didact's data model. Excuse me just a minute. So, that's kind of tricky, right? The configure async method has no indication of which environment it's tied to. All it really knows is that it's tied to a specific flow library, and then that flow library is tied to an environment, and it's tied to a library deployment, which is also tied to an environment, because everything is tied at the environment level. So okay. I gotta really think this through for a minute, okay? I gotta think this through. So we have a configure async method that's essentially agnostic to the library entity, the library deployment entity, and the source entity. And it's agnostic to the environment entity. Is that good or is that bad? Well, that's a good question. I think I sort of like the idea of not having environments as a configurable field to set inside of the configure async method that you see on my screen. Because what if you want to reuse the same flow library across multiple environments, and it's all the same code and everything, it's just you have one environment for production and one for staging. Or maybe you have like a set of customers, so customer 1 goes in this environment, and then customer 2 goes in, to a different environment, right? So it may very well be the case that you want to reuse the same flow library across multiple environments. That could be a flexibility that you want. I don't know for sure if it is, but I could think of use cases where that could be pretty useful. If you wanted to partition flow runs and libraries and flows and so on, let's say by different, tenants, essentially, you would make different environments, like, let's say, for all your customers. So if you had like 100 customers, you'd have 100 different environments or tenants inside of Didact. And so, like, it's very possible that you may want to reuse the same flow library across tenants or across environments. That's a completely fair thing that you may want. So again, the question is, that being said, the configure async method, it has no linkage to the environment. So when all the iflows are instantiated, it would have to pull that metadata from outside of the flow library itself, because that has to come from inside of Didact's database somehow. Which means that when the flow library plugin gets shadow copied into its runtime folder, that means that there has to be some sort of persisted, deployment metadata and source deployment metadata when you shadow copy the contents of that plugin to a runtime folder. Right, somehow I have to have the flow deployment tied to the plugin that gets loaded so that I know where it comes from. And if I know what the library deployment is that's associated with the flow library, I've got everything else. I can get the library from that, and I can get the environment from that. I just need to know the deployment. What is the specific library deployment that's associated with the, loaded plugin, essentially. That's pretty much what I'm looking for. Because again, like the configure async method, the way that I've got it set up right now, configure async has no environment specific information, which makes it really flexible. So, yeah, when the plugin gets loaded, it's going to have to be some DTO that gets fetched from the Didact database. So when plugins get runtime loaded, I'm going to have to persist deployment information somehow. It's kind of what I'm getting from that. I'm going to have to persist deployment information somehow. Right. I gotta tell you guys, this sucks. This is just terrible to develop. Oh my gosh. What an ugly data model. I'm sort of the opinion that I think when a flow library is built and published somewhere with the .NET CLI, there are certain configurations to be made in a CS proj file so that everything gets persisted or configured the way that it needs to during the build process, to optimize it for a plugin architecture. I don't really see a way around somehow having to tie a JSON file or a config file or something as like a persisted artifact to a given flow library. I don't know if there's a way around that, to be completely honest with you. Because, like, I think as you keep pushing newer versions of that same deployment out to the deployment source, you're going to need to remember, like, oh yeah, what's the deployments associated with this, flow library? Well, you kind of need a persistent, config artifact to stick with the library in source control, so you never forget like what it is and like where it's supposed to be going. But see, here's the tricky part about the config file, okay? Like, let's say that you have a flow library that you're creating with some flows in it, right? Let's say you have two environments. You have a staging environment and a production environment. And you want this same library to be used in both the staging environment and the production environment. Both, okay? So you have one flow library where all of your source control is created, but you want to reuse that library across different environments. So you want to send the library to the staging environment first, and then you want to send it to the production environment secondarily. So now you have the same library reaching across different environments. So that's actually going to be classified as two different libraries because they each belong to a different environment. And then there's also going to be two different deployments because those are two different libraries, as far as the entities are concerned. Because again, the way that the Didact data model is set up right now, everything is partitioned at the environment level, basically. That's what the tenant identifier would be, for multi-tenancy scenarios and purposes. So we have an example, like going off of my example, where you want to reuse the same class library across a staging and a production environment. Here we have a complicated example where you have the same source code, the same flows, and the same flow library used across two different environments. So that's two different environments, that's two different library entities, and those are two different library deployment entities and also source deployment entities too. It's the same code, it's the same class library, it's just deployed to two different tenants. But as far as the entities and the data modeling and Didact is concerned, those would technically be two different libraries, even though there's nothing that's changed about them. Again, because I offer multi-tenancy, environments and so on. So that kind of sucks because I have to think then, like, what is the most sensible way in that case for for deployments to work? Like, what is the most sensible way for a deployment to work in that case then? And can we really get rid of the library entity in that case? Like, do we need all of them? I know we need the environment entity, and we need the deployment entity and the source deployment entity, and like say source type or something. I know that those can't go away. The question is, can the library entity go away? We know the environment entity can't go away because of multi-tenancy, right? So that ain't happening. Oh, goodness gracious. Well, if I had a Didact config file, who's to say that I couldn't have an array of deployment profiles or just library deployments, inside of there? Who is to say that could not be an array? Is that possible? Could it be an array? Is that technically possible? Technically, I mean, So if you had, like, let's say different deployment profiles for the same flow library, if I had a config file, let's say for the given class library, then most likely what I would have to do would be to I mean, I would have to wow, I'm really trying to think this through. This is just despicable. Oh my gosh. Alright, so class libraries need to persist some sort of deployment artifact into source control with the rest of the class library. So everything can be tracked in, in source control. Inside of that config file, I could have an array of different class library deployment, I don't know, profiles, whatever I want to call them. Each profile will have specific information on the library itself, and it will have information on the deployment source as well as the environment that the deployment and the deployment source are tied to. Question is, can I ditch the library entity completely, or do I need to keep it? Alright, let's just get back to the first question, the deployments. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? As far as the configure async method is concerned, you're not going to have deployment specific information in here. You're just not. I mean, this is just despicable. I just cannot tell you how frustrating it is to just think through this. Oh, it's so bad. To be honest with you, that's actually sufficiently complex. That's actually sufficiently complex to think about in the sense of like, what am I trying to say here? So like, let's say that the library deployment and the environment information, those are all crucial entity information in Didact's data model to help you like figure out, what library, what deployment, what environment, and so on you're working with. Okay, but like, see, I'm even thinking about the configure async method. Look at my screen. Like, look at some of the things that I offer. So I have like type name. That should always be the same. You have a description. You could say like, okay, yeah, sure. Like the same flow might want the same description across, different deployments or environments or whatever. Like, okay, fine, fair enough. But like, see, here's a weird question, right? Let's say that you send the same flow library to 2 different environments, right? So because of the way that Didact's data model works, different environments means different flow libraries, different flows and flow runs. Sorry, a little tired tonight. It's really late. So, all those entities are different. And then the library deployment is different too. So like, look at the configure async method. Let's pretend, so like you see that there's like a makeshift cron schedule trigger. So like, what if, for example, you deployed your flow library to the staging environment and you deployed your flow library to the production environment, right? But in the staging environment, you only want the cron job on this flow to execute every 5 minutes. And then when you deploy to production, you want it to execute every 1 minute, right? So like, what do we do there? Because if I keep the deployment information and the environment information out of the configure async method, like that's great and all, but see, here's the issue I have with that. Like, if that's the case, then if you published the same flow across multiple tenants, you're going to be stuck with the same cron schedule for both tenants. And you may not want that. Like, one tenant you may want with one schedule, and a different tenant you may want with a different schedule. It's not necessarily the case that you're going to want the same schedule for both tenants. So, I mean, like, what do I do in that case? Like, have I unintentionally crippled your flexibility such that you can't sufficiently reuse flow libraries across tenants like you want to? Do I want to do that? Like, am I not unintentionally crippling your ability to, be flexible with your use cases? Or like, if you want to reuse flow libraries across different environments, I don't want to tie your hands accidentally because I'm being short-sighted. And so like, even if I take the deployment information out of the flow, I'm still stuck with the same essential problem of like, your hands are tied on flexibility for what you can do inside of one tenant and what you can do inside of a different one. And I mean, it's almost like if you wanted a different cron schedule for the same flow and the same flow library, but a different schedule for each tenant. Oh, wow. I'm not sure what to tell you there. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie to you. That's kind of no fun. That's no fun at all. So, how do we want to handle that exactly from like an entity perspective? Oh man. I guess that's the next question, isn't it? So here's the question. Do we want everything to be contained inside of, the flows C# code? Is that what we want? Do we want everything contained inside of the code? Does that even make sense? Like, is that actually what we want? Do I really want that? Truthfully, I'm not sure, actually. I don't actually know. Like, what if we had a deploy async method? We have an execute async method, which is what the actual work is that gets done. We have a configure async method where metadata gets set on the flow. What about a deploy async method? Does that make sense? Would we want a deploy async method or no? Or would that sort of go into the configure async method? I don't know. The configure async method more has to do with a flow configurator regarding deployment, or regarding, cron schedules, descriptions, namings, that sort of thing. But here and again, right? Like here and again, we have deployments like, I'm struggling with the concept of deployments. Like, different deployments could require different configure async settings, depending on which deployment you're targeting. Unless you just make two different class libraries and you copy the code or something like that. I'm not sure like how else to get around that. I don't know what else to do to fix that. Does that make sense? I guess that's a question. Like, should we add a deploy async command to the iFlow interface? And should we keep all deploy information inside of the flow's, source code itself and have you version control it instead of it being like an external artifact file, like, a deploy.json or something? Does it actually make more sense to have you keep it inside here? Does that make more sense? Again, I feel like I'm overcomplicating things, and I don't want to do that. But I want this to be flexible. I don't want to unintentionally tie your hands on something stupid that I don't need to tie your hands on. But it's strenuous and difficult to anticipate all of the flexibility requirements, people may need. Does it even make sense to have deployment information inside of the source code of the flow itself versus having like an external config file like a deploy.json or something? Does it make sense to keep it in C# and add a new method to iFlow called like deploy async? Does that make sense? Is that what I want? Like, do I actually want that? Is that what I actually want? I don't know. I think that's kind of what I'm stuck on right now. What do I do with the deployment metadata, right? How flexible does it need to be? And can it live inside of an external config file, like a build artifact file that's next to the class library? Or does it need to actually live in the source code of the class library to ensure, maximum flexibility? Is that what we need? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. That's a really tough one, right? That's really tough to figure out. I mean, I just don't know. It's hard to say, right? Like, it's just hard to say, dependent upon how flexible people want this to be. So that's my question, maybe to end it for tonight. It's kind of a short stream. Sorry about that. My brain is just shutting down. I'm so tired. I can barely think. I guess that's kind of where we're going to leave it off tonight, and I'll pick it up tomorrow. Hopefully do another live stream tomorrow. Do we want to keep the deployment information outside the class library completely, which is what I've been planning? Or do we have some kind of compelling reason to add a deploy async method to this? I've already got 2 methods, though, is the thing. I don't want to add any more if I don't have to. You know what I mean? I don't want to make it worse if I don't have to make it worse. If that makes sense. Here's the thing. Individual classes inside of the Flow library, they're all contained still in the Flow library. So does it make sense to expose an environment level configuration value where you can assign 2 flows in the same Flow library to 2 different tenants? Let's say you have tenant 1, 2, and 3, and you have, a flow that gets sort of mixed matched and all that, where one flow goes to tenant 2 and another flow goes to tenant 3. Well, that's not, pump the brakes there, hold on. They both belong to the same Flow library, so the Flow library needs to be in both tenants. So, does it make sense to set, does that make sense in that case to set deployment information inside of the Flow itself? If I had a deploy async method. I feel like the best that I could do to accommodate, let's go back to the Flow configure async method for just a second. Let's say that you deploy the Flow to 2 different tenants or 2 different environments. You have environment 1, environment 2. If you want let's say you wanted a different cron schedule trigger in environment 1 versus the one that you'd have in environment 2. Again, going back to my earlier example, let's say you want the cron job to fire every 5 minutes in environment 1, but every 1 minute in environment 2. Well, you're stuck with the same configure async method, right? So how are you going to overcome that? But, it is possible that inside of the iFlow configurator, that gets injected into configure async on line 17 there, who's to say that I couldn't inject the associated library deployment environment ID into it? And then you could do an if-else statement or something where you're looking at line 23. You see on line 23 where the Flow configurator starts having different, flow methods, assigned to it. If you wanted to handle multi-deploy, flow files, I said that weird. If you want to handle multi-environment flow configurations, where environment 1 has one set of configurations and environment 2 has a different set of configurations, I don't see any reason why you couldn't put both sets of configurations inside of the configure async method, and you could just do an if-else or something on the environment name. I don't see anything wrong with that, because you could do hard-coded environments, let's say, or something like that. So I could inject the environment, and I could inject the deployment information into the flow configurator. I could inject that. And that would give you maximum flexibility, where you can literally piecemeal, like one little individual piece at a time, how you would want to run configurations based off of what specific environment. And technically, you could probably do the same thing with the iFlow execution context. I could inject deployment and environment information inside of the iFlow execution context object, and then you could run different code based upon what environment you're in, and you could still have the same library that's used in different environments with different customers, like different tenants, but it's the same source code and the same flow library. And if it's partitioned in my data model, like say by environment, I could just inject information like this into the methods arguments that you're manipulating. So I could inject deployment and environment information into iFlow execution context, and I could inject it into iFlow configurator somehow. Okay, what that would do would give you maximum flexibility still, because depending on what environment you're dealing with or what deployment you're dealing with, you could change the behavior of the flow and reuse it across multiple places. That's actually kind of cool, to be honest with you. Like, that's super cool. That sort of just hit me while we were talking about it, but that actually makes a lot of sense. And that's super, super cool. So I guess the question would be, though, again, like, how do you know what deployment is associated with the flow library? You know what I'm wondering? Okay. Question then, would you actually have to... Question is going to be, again, on the CLI side, when you're creating the flow libraries and you want to publish them somewhere for usage. Okay, do you persist a deployment config file like some sort of artifact on Didact side or not? We know that if I inject relevant entity information into the different methods inside flows, you can have maximal flexibility and reuse flows across different environments. So that part makes sense. But the question is, like, what about getting from the flow library when it's built, getting that metadata into the database, publishing it to the source, and then letting Didact Engine go find it so it can do shadow copying? Do you persist a deployment JSON file, or does it all live strictly in the database, in the metadata? But see, the problem is going to be, like, as you update the flow library and do whatever it is, like, you need to do with it, okay, the problem is going to be, like, how do you remember what's what? How do you remember where the deployment goes? How do you remember what to do with the flow library? Like, how are you going to remember that if there's not a config file for you that gets persisted? At least that was sort of my thoughts, right? All right, well, let's make a note. How about this, okay? Let's make a note here. Inject environment and library deployment data for maximum reuse. Yeah, we'll do /flexibility. So I can just inject relevant information that you might need in each method into the configure async and execute async methods. I can inject that at Didact's level and give you what you need. That gives you maximum flexibility. I've just got to figure out if you need to deploy anything to the respective places. Well, here's kind of my two predicaments, okay, with Didact Engine synchronizing the flow library deployments for local shadow copying. Okay, here's sort of what I'm thinking. When you have a deployment for a given flow library, okay, and you push it up to the deployment source, we've got two options for getting it into Didact Engine. The first option is that Didact Engine has a little cron job of itself, you know, that it's keeping on some kind of interval internally. And it checks your deployment source every so often and just recaches everything that's in there. But it's a whole class library, and that's going to eat up a lot of useless memory when you don't really need it to, which kind of sucks. So, to be honest with you, I'm not actually the biggest fan of like constantly recaching the same flow library, you know, over and over and over again. That just kind of sucks if you don't really need to do it. It's a waste of memory, and it bloats the process of Didact Engine itself when it needs to devote all the resources to executing your jobs, right? So if you push a flow library deployment up to the Didact database, I'm not a fan of constantly recaching the same flow library like a million times over. It's just wasteful memory consumption, you know, that I'd like to avoid if at all possible. But see, the thing with that is going to be, then there needs to be some kind of flag, right? So Didact Engine knows, okay, I grabbed this flow library deployment based off of this date stamp or this ID that existed in the database. And like, let's say it could check all the deployments inside the database, and it could see, right? It could see what the latest date stamp, you know, the deployment date stamp would be, or it could see like maybe like a push ID or something. And as Didact Engine is running, let's say that in environment number 1, you have a flow library that's published. Okay, you published it an hour ago. Now you have a new version, and you've pushed that new version to the deployment source a second time, right? So you've sent and you've overwritten the original files in your deployment source with your new flow library files. That makes a pretty good amount of sense, right? So let's assume the Didact Engine has stayed up and running the whole time. Now it needs the new updated version. How does it know to get it without WebSockets or some kind of real-time thing or something? And the answer is polling. Like, it's going to have to, you know, it's going to have that cron job where it checks the database, right? To see if there's updated flow library deployments that it can find. But it's already got your old deployment. It just needs to know that there's a newer version. So how does it know? How does it know that there's a newer version? How does it figure that out? Well, that's a good question. How does it know? Question then. Okay. I was like gonna go to bed, but now it's like hitting me after I've been talking to you about this for so long. Ow. Okay. Question. Let's do JSON. Okay, so question. Let's say that I have I don't know, a deployment file of some kind, okay? So I've got a $ schema, blah 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 blah. Okay, fine. And then I've got my why is that giving me a hard time? Oh, okay, it's gonna be goofy. Just ignore that. Let's say I have a deployments library deployments. Let's say that that's an array of objects, and then you've got library deployment ID, or you know what, it could be more like a, well, no, I mean, it could be an ID. That makes sense. It could be an ID. Library deployment ID 1 2 3, and then what? Library deployment push ID, I guess. And then that would be some kind of GUID, right? GUID generator. Just grabbing a random one off the internet here. Goodbye, GUID. And of course it's got to be a string. Okay, what if it was like a GUID, and that was the push ID? And maybe, like, for simplicity, let's say it had library deployment name. Deployment 1, right? Let's say it has different. Let's say that it's got a deployments file with different deployments in here, right? Is that possible? Could we do that? I mean, yeah, I think that's possible. Oh, right. And the other thing that we're gonna need, is an environment ID. Environment ID. And let's just say that that's 1, right? Okay. And then, like, we could do environment ID. Let's say that that's 2. So check that out. Who's to say we couldn't have a schema file, like a library deployments JSON file? Maybe that should be a capital D with follow my casing here, camel casing. Who's to say that I couldn't have a library deployments JSON file? Let's say that gets persisted with your library, right? Okay. And you know what? Okay. All right. Fine. Let's do this. Library deployment description. Okay. We'll say staging deployment, right? Something, something simple. All right, fine. Okay, no problem. Okay, let's do that. Let's do, let's say that's production. Okay, because that's environment ID 2. Okay, fair enough. All right, yeah, that makes sense. And then I don't know. Let's say like, I don't know, what would it be like? What do we want to call it here? What do we want to call it? I don't know. Like library, like entry point, something like that. Okay, and then that would be like like flow library.dll. And then, if it's the same library across, different deployments, ideally it would probably be the same, DLL file for each one. But, let's just bear with me here, I guess. Okay. So, like, look at that. Let's think about that for a minute. Does that make sense? Could we do that? Does that make sense? Is there any reason we couldn't do that? Not really. We could do that, right? Better yet. You know what? Better yet, let's reshape let's reshape the schema file real quick. Oh, now I'm gonna be like wide awake. Okay, let's say that we have a library object, and it's not gonna be an array. It's gonna be the same So like, let's just pretend like these config files live like like one per library. Okay, let's say there's one config file per class library. Okay, I think that makes a pretty good amount of sense. So let's say the library. What do we want to call the library, like the library entry point. Okay, and that shouldn't change for each one, because it's the same class library each time. I think that makes sense. Okay, have the library library entry point. Oh, right. Okay, right. Okay. That actually may not work after all. No. That may not work after all, because different libraries in different environments have different IDs. All right, well, that's fine, right? Like, we could work with that, could we not? Let's say like okay, that's fine. Let's say we have a library. Okay, we have a library. All right, it's an object. All right, fine. Let's say we've got, I don't know. Let's say, I don't know. Maybe we don't actually need. You know what? I take it back. We may not actually need the library entity after all. Yeah, we may not. We genuinely may not. Okay, sure. And then what would be the next one? It'd probably be like, library, library, deployment, like a source, let's say. Okay, fine. That would be like an object with stuff inside of it. Okay, yep, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Now the entry point should, the thing about the entry point is it should be the same. So, I don't know, library entry point could be like, flow library.dll. Okay. that would probably enable us to get rid of, you know, this one and this one, because that shouldn't change, you know, no matter which one it is. But you know, you got a deployment source, right? And then, like, let's say you've got like a library deployment. Okay, fair enough, fair enough. All right, so you do that, right? Okay, and then you do, like, you know, you've got like ID, right? Oops, got like ID. Sure. 1, 2, 3, and then you'll have, like, you know, you have like name. Okay, that would be deployment 1. Okay. And then you'd have like, you know, description. Right, and then we'd say, you know, staging deployment. Yeah, no, okay, I think that makes sense. And then we could get rid of ID, name, and description. I think those three, you know, I think those three could go away. That would tie libraries and deployments to the same environment and ensure that they stick together if they're different entities. So, like, I feel like that kind of makes sense. You know what I mean? Yeah, no, okay, I think that makes sense. And then, like, I don't know, like, yeah, maybe it would be like, you know, maybe it would be like push ID or something. I don't know. Like, you know, push ID, you know, yeah, and then we would have, you know, we'd have that. Okay. So what if we got rid of that? Yeah, I don't know. What if that was, you know, what if that was it? I mean, again, like, what is even on the library deployment field? Like, do we even need anything? Genuinely, do we need anything on the library deployment field? I don't actually know. I mean, the environment is tied to a library, but, like, so is the deployment, and they both need to be tied together if there's two different entities. So I think it makes sense. Like, I don't think that's that big of a deal. And then the assembly name, or like the entry point file, like, we could attach that to the library deployment level. So I don't know why that's really necessary either, right? I'm just not sure that's really necessary. And you got created by, updated by, active, rover. Okay, whatever, fine. Like, all that's kind of the same. The only thing then is just going to be the version. You know, we could actually ditch this entire entity right here. We may not need the library entity at all. We could actually ditch the whole thing. Okay, we could actually ditch the entire thing. Here's the thing. But, like, regarding the version, what do we do about that? What do we do about that? Well, that's a real good question, isn't it? What do we do about that? Okay, that's a good question, right? That's a good question. So here's my question. Okay. Do we have a version? Or not? I don't know, that's kind of questionable, if you ask me. But, like, look at this. Okay, that's actually pretty sensible, right? Isn't that pretty sensible? I feel like that's pretty sensible, right? Sure, I think that's pretty sensible. Okay. No, I mean, that makes sense. I think that makes sense. And the library entry point is going to be the same across all environments and deployments because it's the same flow library, you know, every time. Should be, right? I think so. Should be. I think that makes sense actually, because okay, here's the thing, right? So like let's say a given flow library has like 2 different deployments associated with it, like in this example here. As far as the config file goes that goes into your source control, that keeps all the information here, that it needs to keep in here, and all that makes, all that makes a pretty I think that makes a good bit of sense. I'm pretty sure. So let's say okay, all right, fine. So you've got this deployment file, right? This example dummy deployment file. Okay, so then let's say like you could run a CLI command. You could do like didact deployment init. Okay, you could create a deployment. Okay, sure. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Sure. You could do that. And then you could do what? Probably just a push, right? You could just do a deployment push. You would do didact deployment push, and then you would do like a dash like ID dash name or something like that. And then what didact CLI could do is it could look for this file inside of, the root directory, the project, let's say, or wherever you've got the CLI open. So you do didact deployment push, and then you specify which deployment you're wanting to push. And what happens when you push is the push ID gets updated, but maybe we don't actually keep that inside of the, JSON file itself. Maybe we update the push ID inside of the database itself. And so you could do that on your machine before the updated version gets sent to the file source, or you could do it afterwards with CI/CD. And you could do didact. Make sure I'm right about this. You could do didact deployment push. And then do the name or the ID. That would push a new GUID value up to the database. And then if you have didact engine is always on, it would check periodically with a cron job what the library deployments are in the database and their associated push IDs, and if it's been in an always-on status since the last version, it will know to recache a new version of the flow library and kick out the old one. Oh, I think that could work. Did we just make some progress tonight, guys? Did we just make some progress? I was not going to live stream this long at all. I was 100% not going to be on this long. Guys, I think we might have made some actual progress tonight. I'm not even going to lie to you. I wasn't planning on being up this long. I actually think this kind of makes sense. I'm going to think on this tonight, okay? And I'll get back to you tomorrow. Probably I'll do another live stream of this tomorrow. This is good stuff. This is good stuff. I think we might be onto something. Right on. Let's get back to this tomorrow. This sort of just hit me while I was talking out loud to all of you about this, and wow, it feels good to just sort of, yeah, I don't know, it feels good to rubber duck with people. This is good. This is good. Actually feeling kind of good about this. With this, and then with injecting, you know, let's go back to the sum flow. You know, we could inject, right? We could inject the environment and library deployment metadata, you know, inside of configure async and execute async, and you could have maximum flexibility for what you want to do inside the C# code. That'd be pretty stinking cool. I'm not gonna lie to you. You know, no, I think this makes sense. I think this makes sense. I do think this makes sense. I think it makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thinking through the deployment source and the deployment just one last time. Maybe we could do like one last thing. Could rename that to entry point. Type, you know, we could do Yeah, have a type library entry point deployments array with different deployments inside. You know what? I'm kind of digging it. You could have this as a config file. Have this live at the project root directory where the csproj file is. Create it with Didact CLI. I could have a couple commands to make it easy for you to create this. And then when you want to create and push deployments up, just make the deployments with the CLI. You know, you throw a new profile in here, easy peasy, goes into the array. And then when it's time to push it up to the database, you just do Didact deployment push, and you do like the name or the ID or something. And that could live in source control, right? So this is great because with one flow library, you could just make different deployments with the same flow library, which is really cool. I think that makes sense. I think that makes sense, yeah. You know, the only better thing you can maybe do is do this in code, let's say. But I don't think so. No, I think it has to be a deployment file. I think it has to be a deployment file, right? I don't think we could do this in the C# code, could we? I don't think we could do that on the C# code because if it all lives in the C# code, like in a deploy, you know, async method, then like when you deploy the class library somewhere, the flow library somewhere, Didact Engine has to figure out where to get it so it can start instantiating. So it can shadow copy the flow library and then start instantiating all the methods. So how's it going to find it without a CLI, you know, to get a hold of it? Yeah, no, I think this makes sense. The type is never going to change. The entry point is basically never going to change. And then you just have different deployments going to different environments with different sources. You know what? You know what? I see nothing wrong with that. I'm going to sleep on this, okay? And we'll come back to this hopefully tomorrow. We'll see what I think. Wow, I actually kind of like this. I'm actually a little hopeful. I actually made some progress. I didn't think I was going to get, like, I kind of felt like I was stuck in a dead end. I wasn't sure if I was going to get any more progress done before the end of this live stream. I didn't plan on having the live stream go this long. Guys, I think we made some progress. I'm super pumped about this. I think I've got a good draft for a config file we can do for deployments and libraries. And then we'll finally have the main architecture figured out. And then I just got to crank out the source code as fast as possible. I think this could work, guys. I'm going to think on this tonight, okay? Good stream, good stream. Thanks for tuning in. For anybody that watches this, I appreciate it. I'm working hard to get Didact out as fast as possible. This is good stuff. It's going to be good. It's going to be powerful. You're really going to love this. Stick around, okay? I'll be back probably tomorrow for my next live stream. And come check out Didact socials. Make sure to see Didact social profiles so you can keep up to date with the latest news. You can go to the Didact website, didact.dev. Go check out the blog. I put blog updates on there periodically. I'm very active on this YouTube channel, Didact platform on YouTube. I've also got a dedicated subreddit and a Twitter page or an X page and a LinkedIn page and a Blue Sky page for Didact. All of that you can find on the website. Just scroll to the bottom where you can find the socials, okay? Come follow me. Come check out future live streams. Come hang out. I want to talk to you while I'm building this. This is awesome stuff, and it's going to be really good, and I'm pumped, okay? So, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you in the next live stream. All right. Take it easy. See ya.